I'm the Executive Director of the Californians for Equal Rights Foundation, and I will be moderating today's event. In just a moment, you will hear from our panelists. But first, I wanted to give you an idea of what to expect from today's event. After I introduce our speakers, they will each have 12 to 14 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I will read questions from you, the audience, to them. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the event. If your questions don't get answered today, you can send them to nas@rando@nas.org, and we will forward them to the speakers. We will put the email address in the chat box shortly. This event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to the email address you used to register. Thank you very much for joining us for this event. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers for today. Ms. Wai Wah Chin is an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She is the founding president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, an all-volunteer organization advocating for equal rights for New Yorkers, especially in education. She is a graduate of Yale, Princeton, and Columbia, and is a relentless advocate for Chinese American community with a professional background in private equity. Mr. Lance Izumi is Koret Senior Fellow and Senior Director of Education Studies at the Pacific Research Institute. He is the author of the highly praised 2012 book, Obama's Education Takeover, and the co-author of the groundbreaking book, Not As Good As You Think, Why the Middle Class Needs School Choice. Mr. Izumi is the longest-serving member of the Board of Governors of the California Community Colleges, where he served 2 terms as president. He also served as chief speechwriter and director of writing and research for California Governor George Deukmejian, as well as speechwriter to United States Attorney General Edwin Meese III. Mr. Izumi received his Juris Doctorate from the University of Southern California School of Law, his Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of California at Davis, and his Bachelor of Arts in Economics and History from the University of California at Los Angeles. Mr. Devon Westhill is President and General Counsel of the Center for Equal Opportunity. He speaks about civil rights and related issues in the media and at events across the country. Mr. Westhill's writing has been published in numerous outlets, including Scottus Blog, Newsweek, National Review, and the Wall Street Journal, and he has provided expert testimony to both houses of Congress, the EEOC, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Mr. Westhill served as a top civil rights official at the United States Department of Agriculture in the administration of President Donald J. Trump. He has also worked at the United States Department of Labor, Federalist Society, and as a criminal trial lawyer in private practice. After an enlistment in the United States Navy, Mr. Westhill earned his BA in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and his JD from the University of Florida. Wai Wah, let me ask you these questions. Is there a double standard endorsed by the left who pledged to fight the model minority narrative, but then turn around to celebrate race-based affirmative action? What is the reality like in so many Asian American families and communities you've worked with in your advocacy work?
Well, the short answer is yes, there is a double standard. Let me give you a little bit of background on what PCAGNY, that's short for the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, has done. We've been founded just less than a decade ago, but specifically focusing on education first, because we have these specialized high schools, exam schools, entrance. You have to take one single test to get into the top public schools in New York. And they were being attacked because there were too many Asians, which I think is a very, very despicable thing for anybody to say. There should not be too many of anything, of any race. The only thing you could do is say that we have too many students who are not passing. That's a bad thing. You want everybody to be able to pass and pass well. So that's how we began. And so when we talk about the students that we've seen here in New York, the concern here about being used as a wedge, are we being treated properly here? We would have to say, first of all, that is completely wrong. The students here do take, the Asian students do practice. They do the test, what they call test prep, right? But I will first say, no one should ever apologize for studying. This is not test prep. It is not a magic bullet. It is not something that is very strange that nobody else can do. It is basically studying. And when you have schools, and we know many of these families are from immigrant families, very poor families, in fact. A lot of the families in New York anyway, it is the Asian population that are the poorest of all the demographics in New York. And if they choose to sacrifice, this is a sacrifice. It is not cheating the system, as some people would say, by studying, studying. This is something that we should recognize, we should applaud. When families can come in and say that they see that the education in the public schools are not good enough to prepare them for the exams, they choose to supplement with additional work for the kids in after-school weekend studies for not just a test, but for basic academic skills. We should praise them and really applaud that kind of work. So that's the reality, first of all, that these are kids, forget the privilege side, although I will also say that even the wealthy kids of whatever race, they are entitled to the same rights too. If they can pass a test by studying, by the sacrifice of their time, their energy, because they could all be playing cards or going out to the beach, but they don't. That is a sacrifice, and we should applaud that too. So we want to have that kind of thought that all our kids should be entitled to study and be praised for that. So that's the first thing. Now, on the left side, are we being used, are Asians being used as a wedge for a white supremacist structure? You know, I think that is very laughable, but yes, they do say that. Because you say that on the one side, and then immediately on the other side, they say, well, Asians are white adjacent. And we have heard that again and again as we try to pit one group of people against another. We should not be doing that. We have to look at the students as individuals, and that is for not just high schools, but also for colleges. CACAGNY has submitted several amicus briefs in support of the case for SFFA against Harvard, because we see that this is rank racism that is happening. When you judge people, when you tilt people by race, you are denying their individual merit. And merit is a very key thing here. A lot of people don't want to talk about merit because that has become a white supremacist value. Now that's ridiculous. Merit has no color. That is one of the wonderful things. And when we talk about the exam schools, when we also talk about SATs, which are now being disfavored because of what's happening, that we see discrepancies in outcome. Well, I think that we have to think about why that is the case and deal with that separately. But on the basis of what it does by color or by merit, we have to think about merit as an individual quality and not let people be judged by a collective value that has nothing to do with what an individual can choose to do, can affect. It is something that if you cannot change it, you should not be given rewards or punishment for something that you yourself cannot control and improve or not. Now, I would want to take a quick segue, okay, on talking about hate crimes, because this is actually related. When you see in the schools, at our highest, best schools, down to our public schools, high school, actually even below for your kindergartens and gifted and talented programs, when they talk about too many of one race or another at your halls of education, that means that this message is being sent to everybody, that it's okay to attack Asians. That is ridiculous. And that has happened in the last several years. And you see it on the streets. You see it where people are being attacked for being Asians. And it's not white supremacists who are going out attacking us. This is laughable in New York when you had one article and politicians all coming out to say, oh, we have white supremacists attacking the Asians and Trump supporters. And I'm looking around in New York City and saying, where are all of these white supremacists in New York City and what Trump supporters coming from? It certainly didn't happen. And so that is the lie that is happening. But that is the kind of thing we have to stop and say that if you are teaching that it's okay in the schools, why would people not take that lesson to the streets and say it's okay to attack them? So that's the rewards and punishments and that are happening due to race, which we should not be doing. Now, I want to also say that Asians are very, very diverse. We talked a little bit about the economic status that a lot of people don't know. It is true that in very quick time, usually, Asians do achieve better socioeconomic status than many other groups because of many different factors. One is that they tend to save, they tend to be in dual income families, there'll be more intact families. These are all factors that one would consider. But we have a very, very diverse group of people here. You have to remember that whenever people talk about, oh, all these Asians are all alike, that's an incredible either ignorance or intentional deceptiveness. We're talking about Asia being half of humanity. And so we're not all alike. Most of these countries have been fighting each other at some point. You know, you see the Filipinos and the Chinese and the Thai and the Koreans, North and South Korea, Japanese, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, you know, they're extremely different with huge populations with different religions, different languages. To all say, well, there are too many of these. That's rather diminutive. It's just casting us aside, which I think we should all find offensive. The absolute change that has happened in the last several years, we should talk about also the timing when these things have happened. Like you talk about the model minority. That first came up as a term in the 1960s. And so that was the beginning of when you had the civil rights movement and you had a lot of racial identity that was happening. And so to use that term of model minority was an easy way of casting us aside. And if you say that, well, they're the model minorities, you could say that you achieve very well and you just stay quiet. And why is that the case? That's not the way to look at us and disparage it either. That should not be thought of a term to say that that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a sort of a ridiculous thing, actually, because we can all be models of some sort, all right? Every group can, but to say that, well, this is how you are defined, and you can, again, shunt us aside because of that, that is another kind of outrage of trying to say that we are not, our work doesn't count. Our work does count. So when I talk about that diversity, we have to remember that most of the Asians in America right now are actually first or second generation immigrants here. So there are a lot of people with immigrant values. And that does mean that you have to work, and we understand the sacrifice that's going on. So we should all recognize that for not just our group, but you can also say, which a lot of people don't want to talk about, is how there are groups of immigrants from the Caribbean, from Africa, that are far outperforming a lot of even whites in America. And a part of that is because of the values that I talked about of merit, of believing in merit, believing in hard work. Your back is against the wall. You've got to do the work. And this is the kind of work I am talking about, doing the work. And that is the kind of gradual assimilation with the entire culture here of achieving what we here in America should be doing. I'm going to quickly, I know that I don't have that much more time left over here before Lance and Devin will speak to it. And I want to engage in the conversation later, because we've got a lot of topics here that we're all going to come together on challenging. I want to challenge the notion of representation right now, okay? When people talk about underrepresented minorities, I think that is a very, very devious term for saying that somebody is overrepresented. We are not overrepresented. We are represented by our individual merit, and we should remember that. And so whenever people talk about an underrepresented minority, we should talk about how are these individuals with their abilities being used to enter into different colleges. And not every college is the same. Not every kid and student is the same, but we should find the proper kind of place for each one of this. So the whole racial diversity rationale was a wrong one, because if you talk about racial diversity by skin color, that doesn't talk about what was originally intended, which was the diversity of thought, okay? That's what we were talking about. We were talking about a rationale of a robust exchange of ideas. This is what the Supreme Court was talking about initially when they were talking about diversity, not by skin color. If that were the case, everybody would start lying about it, which is very bad again. That is happening, and we do know it. It is a reality, an unfortunate reality that we see year after year when students ask us, oh, what should we put down for our race? And you know you're going to be punished by putting down being Asian. That is something that should never, ever happen, but it is indeed happening. So I will just end quickly on this, that saying that we have to be very careful about these uses and limitations of stereotypes, which is being very divisive and dehumanizing to our students of not just Asian backgrounds, but of every race. Thank you, Wenyan.
Thank you, Wai Wah. And merit is a quintessential American value at the end of the day. So Lance, can you give us a summary of compelling evidence of an Asian penalty in American higher education? Why are progressives so committed to this ideology that scapegoats Asian American students? And has the emerging war on tests exacerbated the situation?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Wenyan. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the National Association of Scholars for organizing this webinar. It's a really vital and timely topic, and especially in light of the pending U.S. Supreme Court cases involving Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And, for those of you in the audience who may not know, Wenyan and I, along with Mackenzie Richards, a colleague of mine from the Pacific Research Institute, co-authored a book just came out called The Great Parent Revolt, How Parents and Grassroots Leaders Are Fighting Critical Race Theory in America's Schools. So, Wenyan is a fantastic fighter for the ideals that we're all talking about here today. Let me start by just discussing something that you often hear about underrepresented minorities, and that it's often said about them that they face a supposed systemic problem in education. But I make the observation that the systemic problem is not systemic racism, but the systemic failure of the public schools to prepare these minority students for higher education. This kind of tags along with what Wai Wah was saying in her remarks. I've always said that in order to fully understand the reason why colleges and universities discriminate against Asian Americans in admissions to colleges, one has to recognize that these policies are meant to compensate and cover up for the education failures of the public school system. So for example, here in California, the University of California Academic Senate found that the most significant factor preventing UC eligibility for underrepresented minorities was the failure to complete an required A through G, which is a college prep course work with a C or better. And even the president of the UC at that time, when this report was issued, Janet Napolitano admitted that the biggest factor in underrepresentation at the University of California is that students fail to fulfill these college prep requirements for admissions. So, beyond this failure of the public school system to prepare underrepresented minorities for college, the public schools are doing a really terrible job when it comes to teaching these students the basic subjects. I mean, you just have to take, for instance, the results on the most recent National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is often referred to as the nation's report card. Now, if you look at 2019, before the pandemic, 10% of African-American eighth graders in California were proficient in mathematics. But you fast forward to 2022, after COVID had begun to subside, that proportion had fallen from this already abysmally low 10% to just 7%. And it was the same for Hispanics. Hispanic eighth graders in California, 15% were proficient in math in 2019, but by 2022, that proportion had fallen from 15% to 11%. So really, if legislators, policymakers, and educators truly wanted to improve the chance for success for underrepresented minority children, then they should attack the systemic quality problem in the public schools by offering a better education alternative for every child, both in California and across the nation. But of course, solving that systemic deficiency in public education is too daunting for policymakers and would require too much courage. So that's why they opt for the easy way out, which is by discriminating against Asian Americans in college admissions so that they can artificially increase the number of underrepresented minorities in higher ed. So, a couple of years ago, I co-authored a chapter on Harvard's alleged discrimination against Asian Americans for a book that was co-edited by Gail Harriott and Naaman Schwarzschild, who are, I know, friends of NAS. And the book is titled A Dubious Expediency. And I wrote about the discrimination against Asian Americans in higher education. And at that time, the legal case against Harvard was going through the lower courts. So our emphasis in that chapter was not so much on the constitutional aspects of the case, but on the empirical evidence to prove that Harvard had created this structure of discrimination against Asian Americans. That's why, we dove deep into the statistical data and that was presented to the federal courts, and that overwhelmingly showed that there was a structural discrimination against Asians. And Harvard, used a so-called holistic admission system to disguise the fact that it held Asian Americans to a higher standard than other students. I mean, it was basically the same type of system they used to discriminate against Jewish students in a previous era. The plaintiffs in the Harvard case presented research by Duke University economics professor Peter Arcidiancano, who put together this extensive 2 decades long admissions database that allowed him to analyze how race, ethnicity, and other factors affected admissions at Harvard. And his findings were shocking. First, he found that Asian American applicants as a whole are stronger on many of the objective measures than any of the other racial or ethnic groups, including test scores, academic achievement, and extracurricular activities. And specifically, Asian Americans, their average SAT scores were 25 points higher than white applicants, 154 points higher than Hispanic applicants, and 218 points higher than African American applicants. And so therefore, Asian Americans also had the highest academic index, which is the combined score for standardized testing and high school performance. So, and this is as a side note, and I know that Wen Yuan has written about this quite extensively recently. I should point out that given how Asian Americans outscore other groups on the SAT, it's not surprising that many colleges and universities have decided to drop the SAT and ACT as requirements for admission. And so I think it's ironic that those who oppose testing claim that the tests are racist when the impact of eliminating the test has the greatest effect on a minority group, namely Asian Americans. But anyway, getting back to the Harvard case, what Professor R.C. Diancano used, he used an example of an Asian American male applicant who is not disadvantaged, and based on these characteristics, resulted in a 25% chance of admission to Harvard. Simply changing his race of this Asian applicant to white, all right, same characteristics, but changing his race from Asian to white would increase his chance of admission from 25% to 36%. But changing his race from Asian to Hispanic would increase his chance of admission from 25% to 77%. And changing his race from Asian to African American would increase his chance of admission from 25% to 95%. So what R.C. Diancano said was that despite being more academically qualified than any of the other three major racial or ethnic groups, Asian American applicants had the lowest admissions rate, and Harvard's own data from 2000 to 2019 bore that out. So a key way that Harvard damps down Asian admissions, despite the fact that on these objective factors, they're doing so well, is to penalize them by using this holistic system that looks at personality traits such as likability, integrity, helpfulness, courage, and kindness, and to say that Asians do not excel in these areas, which is both absurd and really incredibly insulting. If Asians were just admitted based upon the objective academic criteria, R.C. Diancano said that Harvard would have more than 46% more Asians over a 6-year period. And again, Harvard's own statistics said that their student body makeup would be about 43% Asian Americans, as opposed to the 20% of Asians that has historically been the cap of Asian admissions at Harvard for decades. So what this demonstrates really is that Harvard had really put in place an admission structure of racial stereotyping that resulted in the systemic and intentional discrimination against Asian Americans. And, in this case with Harvard and UNC, you find, similar things going on at the University of North Carolina. And I think that, one of the things that when you look at this case, and Devin, I know, might talk about this, is that, if you look at the briefs that have been submitted in the Harvard and UNC case, there have been dozens of briefs that have been supporting race preferences filed on behalf of hundreds of colleges, universities, and higher education associations. Not one brief from any college or university has been filed on behalf of Asian Americans. And so I think that is shocking. And, Bill Jacobson at Cornell, who I know a lot of our audience knows, has said that, he is shocked by these briefs and their complete lack of sympathy for Asian victims of discrimination. And so I think that, what this, just shows is just the, extent of this support for racial preferences by the education, by higher education, political and judicial elites in favor of, discriminating against Asian Americans. And the thing of it is, though, is that what you find, though, is that the American people do not support this. The elites might support race preferences, but the American people do not. 73% of Americans in recent surveys are against using race in college admissions. And these include large proportions of African Americans and Hispanics. And, in the book that Gail and Mayman edited, that, in which I contributed a chapter, I quoted this one California student named Sohini Ashoki, and I thought that she really encapsulated, what we're fighting about here. She said that creating racial quotas and trying to diversify a campus is most definitely not a step towards equality. and it's not a way to counteract racism. She said that American colleges have changed their narrative to promote a more diverse environment rather than fighting discrimination, which is evident in the treatment of Asian American students. And she concluded that it's crucial to stop allowing race to overshadow personal merit or achievement when it comes to determining who the future college students of this country are. And I think that, she's absolutely right. And, I think with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank again, National Association of Scholars for putting on this event, and look forward to hearing what Devin has to say, and look forward to the questions from our listening audience. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Lance. And not only do public opinion polls show that the majority of Americans do not support race-based considerations in public policy making, including college admissions, whenever Americans have a chance to vote on the ballot, they have voted consistently against racial preferences. And that this happened in progressive states like California and Washington state in recent years. So, we are the majority. It's just that we're not as loud maybe as the other side. So with that being said, Devin, why do you think the DEI movement is bad for Asian American students, and more importantly for the entire country? What will the upcoming Supreme Court rulings on the Harvard and UNC cases mean for higher education and mean for America? And what more do we need to do beyond the court of law to address these issues?
Thank you very much, Wen-Yin, and to my co-panelists as well for fantastic presentations, and to NAS for having me here. It's a wonderful pleasure to be, for the first time, a part of a National Association of Scholars event on a very important topic, something that Wen-Yin and I were discussing just Friday with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where they had a few panels discussing anti-Asian racism in the United States and the federal response to it. I am critical of the quote unquote response. In fact, I think that's where some of my remarks will start here. Let me just say, though, that the organization that I run, the Center for Equal Opportunity, has been in this space for a long time. I heard Wai Wah discuss her group, and that I guess you're almost 10 years in. The Center for Equal Opportunity has been at this for almost 30 years. This is an aspect of American life, particularly in higher education, race preferences, that goes back over 40 years. And we could talk about just how far back that does go. A lot of it is sort of hidden in the admissions black box in these elite, especially elite institutions. But CEO has been working on this for 30 years to push back against the suggestion that we ought to be judging people by the color of their skin or where their ancestors came from. And I want to get into a little bit of why that is somewhat arbitrary and confusing as well, particularly in this country and particularly at this time in history. But let me start with the first question that Wen-Yin asked me, and that is, so the DEI movement or DEI craze, what's wrong with it, and why is it particularly bad for Asian Americans? I think as we currently do DEI, as we see it done, 99% of the time, it's bad because it treats people differently based on their skin color, based on where their ancestors are from, based on who they choose to go to bed with at night. That has a lot of problems, not least of which, if you're Asian American and you're high performing, right, if you're culturally committed to academic achievement, for example, if you're culturally committed to family cohesion, which by and large, the vast majority of those individuals who get put under, whether they like it or not, the Asian American or Asian umbrella, Wai Wah was suggesting, that's a pretty large umbrella, and maybe not everyone thinks that they ought to be under that umbrella either, right? They've been warring for a long period of time, a lot of folks who are under that umbrella. If you value those sorts of things and you succeed at a disproportionate rate, you must be brought down for the benefit of equity of outcome. And this is something I discussed last week with the Commission on Civil Rights. What that means, as opposed to equality, right? Treating everyone the same, providing equal opportunity to success. Equity, which we've heard a lot about over the last few years, means that we have to engineer outcomes to reach a preferred or proportional balance. And in this sense of races or ethnicities, sort of on the back end. How we do that is to provide preferences for some, certainly not for others, and then still for others still to actually bring them down because they are quote unquote overrepresented. This is problematic for a lot of different reasons, not least of which I like to quote. I like this quote. A wise person once said, and I do believe that most people who care about this equity concept care about minorities. But the smallest minority on earth is the individual. And I think people who care about minorities can't really say that they genuinely care about minorities. They don't care about the individual. And unfortunately, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts as we see them today across American society, from corporate America to higher education and so on and so forth, are actually perverting our American understanding of justice accorded to individual rights. And that's one of the major problems that I see with DEI. Now, that being said, I also agree with Wai Wah in her suggestion that, look, if this is done right, diversity, right, there's nothing wrong with that, right? If people are bringing to the table different perspectives on an issue, based on or motivated by their life experiences, that's a really positive thing. But unfortunately, the way I see it done right now is not sort of from a true diversity lens. It is from a lens that some people are undeserving because they're already overrepresented, and some people need to have a boost because of, for whatever reason, they're not meeting objective standards for hiring, for promotion, for positions and seats in an oncoming class at a university or college. Two big cases. Lance was just talking about this, that are at the Supreme Court right now. As I suggested, CEO has been involved with these matters for a long period of time. We were involved in no less than 5 amicus briefs in these 2 cases, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, and then SFFA versus University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I have one of my degrees. So this is definitely of interest to me. That's just one of the many reasons why it is. What does it mean? What does the ruling mean that comes down from these 2 cases? Well, I mean, on the one hand, it could be, keep the status quo, right? Keep affirmative action totally intact. And really the way things are being done is not discriminatory. It does not violate our civil rights laws, particularly Title VI, which prohibits, among other things, race discrimination and college admissions. And also, as it pertains to the University of North Carolina, a public university, as opposed to Harvard, a private university, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply either, right? Or it continues to allow a carve out in just this instance, because the educational benefits, the purported educational benefits of a diverse student body are just so compelling, and the schools are doing it in such a narrowly tailored way that this is okay. No one expects that to happen. Okay, I just had to put that out there, right? We don't know what the Supreme Court will do. We've been surprised many times before. In 2003, the Gratz and Grutter cases and Fisher cases of 2016, and we can go on and on. There's a lot of stuff in between that could happen, and we can discuss what that means. But I will say what I expect to happen, what a lot of commentators expect to happen, legal experts expect to happen at the Supreme Court, and that is that the current composition of the court is situated such that it will prohibit, probably outright, the use of race or ethnicity in making decisions on who is allowed to attend a college or university. That's a fantastic thing. What that means is that the Supreme Court of the United States, for the first time in decades, first time in my lifetime, will actually say, you cannot divvy people up by race. That is totally antithetical to what it means to be an American institution. And you know what? We're going to actually uphold that finally now. That really means a whole lot. And I think it also means something else, and something that I discussed again in my testimony before the commission, Civil Rights Commission, last Friday, and that is that we actually got it wrong for a long period of time too. And I hope that that comes out in the cases, right? And that we don't just sort of pop confetti and clap and say, okay, it's all over now. No, you know what? People have been discriminated against, as a result of their race and their ethnicity, and who knows what else, for a long period of time in this country, even to this day. And that ought to be recognized. And that ought to be something that we don't allow to happen again. We need to pivot in this country badly away from that sort of thing. And that's going to be sort of a tremendous sort of part of the decision if it comes down the way I expect it to come down. And a lot of people think it will, and I hope that it does. However, this does not mean that schools are just going to throw up their hands and say, "Oh well, nothing we can do now." Now, don't get me wrong on that. I expect that this will cut down substantially on treating people differently based on their race, based on their ethnicity and other immutable characteristics such as those. But I don't think it's going to go away completely. I think we have to remain diligent, particularly those lawyers around the country who follow these issues, who are equal protection practitioners. FOIA these schools, ensure that what they're doing is actually in line with what the Supreme Court says. And that also, and I suggested this to the commission on Friday as well, civil rights institutions, civil rights agencies, their job becomes more onerous. They have to ensure that these schools are abiding by Title VI, right? The court will finally say, this is over. Now you need to make sure that you're monitoring them and making sure that you're enforcing Title VI protections for students. There's a lot more I can say about that, but let me go to the final point that I think you asked about, Wenyan, and I want to leave a lot of time to talk with my co-panelists and to hear questions from the audience as well. What else needs to be addressed, I think, is the other question, beyond just the law. This actually, despite the fact that I'm a lawyer, is almost sort of my favorite thing to talk about. And I think it's going to be increasingly my favorite thing to talk about, because hopefully this is finally going to be settled as a matter of law by the Supreme Court. One of the things that I think we do not so well, and when you just suggested potentially this being true, is we don't talk enough about this stuff to the public. We're not loud enough about it. And we don't do it often enough. I'm really pleased the amount of events that I've been able to be a part of, and that I've seen, and that I know that have taken place on the subject of race preferences in American life as a result of the Supreme Court cases that are currently pending. But again, this stuff is not over. We need to continue to be talking about it with the public so that the public understands what's at stake here, what is actually happening behind the scenes that they're not, issues that they're not privy to, and to bring the concept to the public in a way that actually moves them, that is actually interesting to them, and is actually going to make them act such, in the event that they need to act on these issues, such as voting, as you suggested, and ensuring that California, despite being deep blue, does not, sort of backtrack into race preferences and public life and those sorts of things, right? Continuing to do this. And I think, unfortunately, we're not often talking about these things enough. We're not loud enough about these things. And oftentimes when we talk about them, they're not really hitting the public in a way that moves them. And I think we need to be thinking about how we do that. With that, I will stop. I've got a lot more I'd like to maybe get into and respond to some things I've heard, more things I've heard from Wai Wah and Lance and Wenyan as well, but I want to hear from the audience too. And to the extent that I can continue to talk, I will, like any self-respecting lawyer. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. We have some questions in the Q&A box and some in the chat. Bob asks this question: did rich whites and college admission staffs become much more supportive of racial quotas right when traditional elites were increasingly replaced by Asians? So basically, privileged whites are ending merit to protect their privilege. Who would like to take on this question?
Well, I think that. Oh, go ahead, Devin.
No, please go ahead. I was just going to mention. It almost sounds like I was going to suggest a Wai Wah question, a Wai Wah, considering the model minority sort of topic. But I've got a few other thoughts. But please, Lance.
Well, I mean, all I was just going to mention when you're on was just that it seems to me, again, harkening back to the experience of Jewish Americans being discriminated against in the Ivy Leagues. The reason why was because the elite establishment at that time, felt threatened by this new group of students who are coming into the system and who were incredibly well qualified. And unless there was a way that you could discriminate against them and prevent huge numbers from coming in, that they would be displaced by this new group. And I think that you are seeing the same thing with Asian Americans, that all the things that Wai Wah was talking about, that Asian Americans generally they study hard, they work hard, the parents push the kids to do well in education because they see it as a way to improve themselves, get out of maybe low income situations. And so there's this momentum within the Asian community to succeed in education, and that I think it really mirrors what was happening 100 years ago with Jewish Americans. And again, you see this similar reaction from the establishments of both those times.
I actually think that the start for affirmative action began before the Asians became a so-called threat. So if you think about the 1960s, there were not that many Asians. That the wave came maybe 20 years later, actually. It was probably more a way of buying peace that was happening, because if you look at what was happening in the 1960s, you had the first large wave of the protests that were happening. And as most people know, Asians are not ones who go out and break the windows. I've gone to protests with Asians, and there'll be 20,000 people in Brooklyn. We had a huge protest there, and at the end of it, everybody was told, pick up after yourself. Make sure you get all the garbage into the garbage pails. Make it look as if you weren't even here. What's that for a protest? Okay, so I think that it was not quite to protect that elite status. Even if some individuals may have thought that, I do not believe that was the basic motivation. And you have to remember that this model minority that Devin just brought out again, it's a way of medicalizing also what Asians do, to say that you're a model, there's something wrong with you, that you study so hard. Just think about the very insidious way that they're trying to position us. That is a choice. We would never go and criticize somebody and say, you're planning to join the Olympics and you want to be on the racing team, you run too much, okay? There's no such thing as that. If you want to go and get into a top school, guess what you have to do? You have to study. And we shouldn't go and criticize anybody who's trying to do that. We can talk about the numbers of hours. Asians study twice as many hours as whites and 4 times the hours as Blacks. And so this is from a Brookings Institute study. That says something about choices.
Thank you, Wai Wah. Joseph asks this question. I think it's related to the racial pairing argument. One side effect of all this seems to be a breakdown of vital mentor-mentee structures between races. A lot of the essentialist mindset causes voluntary racial segregation. Do you think this could be an intentional aim for those that push this and seem to hate our country and our ideals?
I'll just jump into that because I know that everybody else is formulating even deeper, better answers. So on the sort of separating everybody, I think that that is a problem. Okay, when you have students who are going into separate graduations, separate housing, separate classes based on race, we have a problem. This is not what universities are supposed to be. If we are trying to get that kind of diversity of ideas, you don't get it by separating people into these sectors. This is where we talked about it. I mentioned before this notion of representation. When you come in as a college student, you are not representing all the other people. Nobody voted you in. You're not a representative of your race, and you're not going to get benefits for the rest of your race. You're not going to, when you come out from college and you get a great job, you are not going to share the benefits to all of your race. That is not how it works. So there are huge fallacies in this whole representation that's going on. But please, I see Lance and Devin waiting.
Well, I'll just say really quickly, that I totally agree with you, Wai Wah, about this illusion of representation, because and you mentioned this, I think, in your remarks, that it gets away from the individual. I mean, each individual is different. I mean, it doesn't matter what race you are. You may belong to the Asian race or the Hispanic race or whatever the race, but your individual experience could be totally different from everybody else within that group. I mean, it may be that you as an Asian American, despite the fact that as you pointed out, many Asian Americans have intact families, but you may be from that family that is not intact. You may have had all these other types of difficulties that you've had to overcome, whether it's, a divorce or maybe violence, or whether it's low income, all these, I mean, and the difficulty, let's say, even in the type of schooling you went to. Maybe you were in a poor public school that didn't produce a lot of good students or high performing students. And so therefore, by simply putting you as an Asian into that Asian box and saying that your individual experiences don't matter is, I think, a huge disservice to these individual Asians and to individualism, which is really at the core of the American ideal, and really undercutting individualism, as a principle by which we in this country should aspire.
I'm not exactly sure I understand the question fully. I'll answer what I've very briefly, that I don't think there's any intentional aim. I could be wrong about this, to break down mentor-mentee relationships along racial lines, and then pivot to answer the question I wish was asked, and maybe it is the question that was asked. I just am not sure, and that is sort of the arbitrariness of racial distinctions to begin with, is, I think, something that's extremely problematic, but important to talk about in talking race preferences and race relations in general. As Wai Wah was suggesting in her initial monologue, the Asian umbrella is very, very large, and individuals within that umbrella, under that umbrella, might not feel particularly comfortable under that umbrella, alongside other individuals who are placed there. I think that's extremely problematic this day and age, and in this country, given the racial diversity, the multi-ethnic, multiracial society in which we live in the United States of America, at least. For example, I would be exceedingly confused, right, about where my children fall, sort of in the checkbox of race and ethnicity. I'm already a little bit problematic because my mother is white, my father is Black. Now that is somewhat more sort of traditional American, if you will, but My wife is white and Vietnamese. And so our children, I guess, are white, Black, and Vietnamese. How much of them, right, gets a preference and how much needs to be brought down? What exactly are they? Are they under the Asian American umbrella and ought they to be sort of throttled in their admissions applications to colleges? Or should they be given some sort of boost because they are a favored minority based on at least part of their DNA? This becomes very, very difficult to parse out. And I think increasingly so in a very multi-ethnic, multiracial society where folks don't fit cleanly into a box. And then we get into a situation where we're doing some pretty ugly things to try to figure out where people fit, right? Looking at their skin color, asking them maybe for their DNA report or something of that. You know, we saw at least one senator put out their information on their DNA at one point a few years ago. You know, is that a place that we want to be in this country? I don't think so. And I think as we become increasingly mixed racially and ethnically, I think we have to really think about whether this sort of experiment in racial experimentation makes any sense at all. So I thought I'd just share that point.
Yeah,
I will just say that the last time there was a major, as to my poor knowledge of history, tracking of this kind of blood identity was under the Nazis. That was not a good example to follow. And we should be very conscious of knowing the history, that this was wrong then, it is wrong now.
I've even seen news about preschoolers and kindergarteners being asked to participate in coloring activities involving different skin tones. It's just silly, and we should not elevate that into public policy importance. So I have here a comment and a relevant question. Comment comes from Linda. I have little confidence in schools honoring scholars' decisions. The elites largely ignore the will of the voters, stakeholders. They will blow it off for change their opaque admissions metrics. The complaints and violations get filed and buried, but nothing changes. And then the question comes from Dave. How creative are administrators likely to be getting around any Supreme Court decisions on race-conscious admissions?
See them getting creative already. We see some signs that schools are anticipating exactly what I suggested is likely to happen in these cases, and that is the prohibition of the use of race and ethnicity in college admissions by, for example, eliminating standardized tests like the SAT. I think the most recent school that did this, although this is happening so fast it's hard to keep up, is Columbia University. They're no longer interested, apparently, in SAT scores of their incoming applicant classes. What I've been tracking most closely are law schools that have been doing away with the requirement that incoming or applicants submit a law school admission test, which now I think it's up to like 40 schools that have pulled out of that that ranking. This is all the point is these are creative ways that schools are already beginning to rejigger their admissions criteria for admitting students onto their campuses to maintain as skin deep a diversity as they possibly can, under the understanding, right, that on the whole, Asian Americans are going to continue to outperform on these metrics. And their preferred races today, Black, Hispanic, Native American applicants are on the whole going to continue to underperform. And so this is a way in which they might be able to continue to have the racial diversity, proportionality that they would like on their campuses. We see it happening already. I think they're actually pretty creative indeed.
Yeah, I think that you're right, Devin. The elimination of the standardized testing. I mean, you've seen that here in my state, in California, where the University of California State University, they've eliminated standardized testing, the SAT and ACT. And so, I think that what you end up getting is, just this reliance on high school GPAs for the most part. And, what that does is, there's this also, concurrent grade inflation that is going on, so that, if you see somebody with a 3.8, 3.9, 4.0, I mean, is that really a 4.0? Or is that really something that was maybe a 3.3 that now is been pushed up? And we've seen that even especially during COVID, right? Kids were passed along when they really should have failed. Many school districts have, relaxed their grading practices, and some of them have even eliminated the D's and F's in their grading. And so therefore, when you see, these schools eliminate standardized tests, they're really doing a disservice to any student who really takes achievement and performance seriously. And so it's not just Asians. I think that one of the things that came out of the elimination of the standardized tests in the University of California was that the report by the Academic Senate, which actually said that many underrepresented minorities actually are helped by standardized tests. Because if you look at, what the experience of many underrepresented minorities, especially if they're in difficult family backgrounds where there's a lot of, outside of school pressures on them that cause their grades to decline or to be low, they can actually often perform very well on a test because they actually are inherently very bright people. And yet, because of the elimination of standardized tests, they don't get that opportunity to show what they have. And instead, they're, forced to rely upon, these more subjective measures, which may not be actually to their benefit.
And
I
I
agree
believe
with
the
you all.
same.
I just want to mention that the other things that they're going to start looking at is zip codes, right? And so they're going to find all sorts of proxies. And it's not just getting rid of the test, which I could see when you will probably ask the next question on further on the test. I think that the test is a measurement. And if you get rid of that kind of measurement, you don't know who's sick. It's the same thing as a thermometer. Just because you don't like somebody who's sick, okay, you don't get rid of the disease by just saying that, well, we redefined the thermometer away. And that's what's happening.
And I believe the same report from the Academic Senate at the University of California also concluded that low-income students would get ahead through standardized tests, and they recommended the UC Board of Regents not to drop the consideration of SAT and ACT. However, the Senate still went ahead in 2020 to temporarily go test-free. And then I believe it was last year that the whole system went completely test blind. And the UC system is only one of the over 1,700 US accredited four-year universities and colleges that have gone test-free or test blind. And this is a follow-up question. Please comment on the war against meritocracy in general. For instance, Fairfax County, Virginia, withheld announcements of national merit status until after the deadline for college application submissions. This comes from Deborah, who would like to take on this question and comment.
Well, I think that I'll take just a quick stab at that. What Fairfax County did by not making that information about national merit scholarship commendations to the parents and to the students was going to what Devin was talking about when he was discussing the issue of equity, right? Equity is not equality. Equity is same outcomes. Equality means the same opportunity for everybody to succeed depending upon their talent and so and their hard work. equity means that everybody should, be at the same level. And so if you recognize certain people, for their hard work and their achievement, then, that undercuts that left-wing notion of equity as being same outcomes. And so I think that's why they withheld that information. And so, I think the problem is that, for the average layperson, they confuse equity with equality. And so therefore, people then tend to nod their head when, someone says that, hey, we're just, trying to advance equity in the system. And a lot of people think that simply means equality, and they support that. They do not support. However, if you explain it to them, what happened in Fairfax County, they don't support, for example, what happened at Thomas Jefferson High School there, where you ended up having caps on or elimination of a lot of the meritocratic admissions criteria for admissions into Thomas Jefferson. And you ended up having, and as I think, as you pointed out, when you're in your own research on high schools in California, that you end up having caps on schools with higher Asian American enrollment. And that's what happened in Fairfax County, so that you ended up essentially discriminating against Asian Americans, because of this emphasis on equity.
The notion of equity is all about equal outcomes, regardless of what your abilities, your effort, and your dedication to it. You have to want to do this too. And once you say that we're going to have equal outcomes for everybody, you will diminish the ability to excel. If we believe in merit, if we believe in excellence, there is no such thing as excellence if everybody's equal. So we have to give up on something. And that's what equity tries to destroy. It destroys the individual abilities and excellence. And as far as the TJ case goes, that was reprehensible. It was absolutely reprehensible what happened there when the administrators, and it wasn't just TJ, you had several schools all doing that to deprive students of their achievements. That is absolutely outrageous.
I would just say that sort of a little bit, I guess, strangely or counterintuitively, despite everything that we've been saying about the push for equity, its proponents aren't even really consistent when it comes to that. They actually really don't care at the end of the day about equity of outcome across the board, at least as a principle. They certainly care about it when it's convenient for them, when they're trying to push a certain outcome that they want. But you never hear anyone who's a proponent of equity say, you know what, we should have the NBA or the NFL look more like America, right? This is the common sort of retort to the idea that we should have equal outcomes. No, no one would watch the NBA or the NFL if we had to have a proportional representation of races and ethnicities and so on and so forth across.
I'm looking for those Japanese basketball players.
So they're also inconsistent. It's not a principle thing. They actually are attacking certain things, and those are things that actually Asian Americans in particular excel at, educational attainment and the like. One additional thing I wanted to say, I really liked Wai Wah's suggestion that we ought not to get rid of the thermometer, right? We need to be testing whether or not a system is sick, there are problems. And this is oftentimes, and this goes back to my suggestion about how we talk about these issues, how do we, moving forward, what's next outside of the law. I think that's a great way to talk about why, even if you don't think that standardized tests really are a good predictor for what they purport to be a good predictor of, right? College success or future success, whatever. They certainly do seem to predict something. And that is sort of a problem in the system, in the pipeline of individuals who are coming up. Lance talked about this in terms of the public education that Black Hispanic students are getting, for example. That's a problem. These things help us to identify root causes, root illness or disease, if that's the best way to put it. I'm very much interested in talking about those sorts of things. And unfortunately, when you're injecting race preferences at the last end of the pipeline, not only are you doing no good, you're doing affirmative harm, right? You are preventing and obscuring symptoms of a disease that you really ought to be trying to cure, really trying to be putting some effort and resources behind addressing. Why, on balance, Black kids, Hispanic kids, and so forth are doing or are underperforming. And if we get rid of these sorts of objective criteria to judge how they're doing, it makes it that much more difficult to identify if there's anything amiss.
And masquerading these root problems that deserve maybe long-term policy solutions with a bandage, so-called slogan of equity, is really just a medicine that's worse than the disease. And the last question comes from Harry. How can we shrink the leverage of privileged elites? It seems that the focus on engineered equity is a counter-revolution of privileged elites in the name of the oppressed. They gain more and more power by claiming to advance the interest of the disadvantaged while retaining more and more power, as racial preferences often backfire against Blacks and Hispanics. What do you think?
I think that to start with media, social media, we have to think about, what does elite mean? Who controls the discourse? The first thing is that we have to make sure that we are not being censored. And many of us are, either on the social media or even in places where in college, where you cannot even speak certain things. That's a censorship that's happening all around. And for the National Association of Scholars, I think that is of particular concern at the universities, where you have the lack of diversity of thought, that people are self-censoring because professors, tenured professors, are losing their jobs. That's a very, very dangerous place we're in.
Well, I would say that really, if you wanted to have a textbook case study of how to get around the elites, is really, what Wen Yuan was, intimately involved in the stopping Prop 16 in California from passing and overturning Prop 209, which is our ban on race preferences in government. And I think that you look at who all the elites were that were in favor of eliminating the ban on race preferences. It was like, virtually all the legislature, and certainly the Democrat supermajority there. You had business, corporate elites, you had education elites, you had every elite sector in society was in favor of eliminating the ban on race preferences in California. And yet you had this grassroots movement spearheaded by first generation Chinese Americans, really, and using at the time, things that, not just social media, but just really almost old-fashioned things like car rallies to generate this enthusiasm amongst the grassroots. And I think people initially laughed at these car rallies and things like that. Well, how are these Asians going to stop this big steamroller of all of the elites who are pushing this thing through? They were going to lose, the Asians were going to lose by 20, 30 points, when in the end, Proposition 16 was stopped by a larger percentage than voted for Prop 209. And so therefore, I think that this just shows that the elites do have their hands on the levers of power, but that doesn't mean that the grassroots, because we do have the numbers. And that's the thing that we have to figure out a way to leverage, and that's through organization, through what like the Californians for Equal Rights Foundation, what Wen Yun represents, and others, the grassroots organizing, I think, is where our future lies, at least in the near term. And what you do, Wai Wah, in New York with your group, I think is a real model for the rest of the Asian community as to how we can stop these bad things from happening, and then initiate good things.
I would add the term domestic terrorists, parents as domestic terrorists. We have to take that term and wear it proudly, as some of the people here in this room here understand that parents cannot be taken for granted, and we must step up for our kids.
Just going to say that Lance and Wai Wah took the words right out of my mouth in suggesting that, look, the elites are outnumbered. First of all, it's really good to identify the fact that it's really the elite social engineers that are pushing this sort of thing, right? It's not regular people who just go to their job doing accounting or driving a school bus or parenting at home, right? There are people in Washington, there are people in large metropolitan areas whose job is to be the diversity czar or to do whatever associated with these things. They are outnumbered tremendously. What we have to do going forward, hopefully with a positive ruling from the Supreme Court at our back, is to make the case to our friends, our families, our communities, that these things are against our best interests, that we ought to be caring about people as individuals, focus on our families, focus on strengthening our communities, and to push back against the elites, because we have the power. We literally have the manpower to do it. They're outnumbered 1,000 to 1, and we ought to remember that. It's hard work to organize, but we can do it. And Wenyan has shown in the past that it can be successful.
And let me just add real quickly on top of that, Devin, is that in the book that Wenyan and I co-authored, The Great Parent Revolt, I mean, that's one of the things we focus on is this grassroots organizing that you see amongst those domestic terrorists, Wai Wah, who are seeing what's happening in their school systems, and you see, like Bombs for Liberty, you see No Left Turn in education, Parents Defending Education, all these different grassroots parents groups that have sprung up over the last couple years or so. And I think that it's amazing, both the growth of these organizations, like Moms for Liberty has went from nothing to like 85 chapters, like 200 chapters across the country with 85,000 members nationwide, just over the last couple of years. And then the impact of that has been the flipping of these school boards all across the country, not just in red states, but in purple states and blue states, even here in California. And you're seeing the impact. And I think that just goes to show you that, as you said, Devin, that we have the numbers. We just need to organize our numbers in order to be able to effect that change that we want, and to prevent the other side from just ramming down their ideological agenda down the throats of our children.
And the coalition, the grassroots coalition, which is national and growing against these ideological evasions, is truly bipartisan and diverse. We have people from every background and different political persuasions: immigrants, native-born Americans, Democrats, independents, conservatives, Republicans. We are all we have, I think the last few years has really energized a great segment of the American population to get together and push back with strategy, with organization. So with that being said, thank you for joining us for this event hosted by the National Association of Scholars. In a moment, we'll proceed to closing remarks from our speakers. But before we do, I wanted to take a moment to say that if you enjoyed this webinar, there are several ways you can help us continue to make them. The first is, if you're not already a member of the NAS, join. It really does help us, and you will get special access to these and other events from the NAS. The second thing you can do, if you're already a member or if you simply want to go the extra mile, is to donate to us. You will find links in the chat below that will let you learn more. And the third thing you can do is share the videos of these events with others and tell them about our work. It has been lovely to see more people joining these webinars each week, and we want to continue to reach as many people as possible. With that, I'd like to turn now to our speakers for their closing remarks. Devin, would you like to start?
Happy to, because my closing remarks are pretty brief. I just want to say, I mentioned this before with just the panelists here before we got started and invited the rest of the audience in. And I think it's something that is worth closing on and that we should continue to remember. And that is, there's a famous saying that, first one comes for a certain race or ethnicity, right? First, they came for the Jews, right? And just because you're not a Jew, right, you didn't stand up to them, right? Next, they came for another race or ethnicity. Look, the whole point is right now we're seeing a disfavored race being sort of attacked. Asian Americans for their commitment culturally and really individually in a lot of ways to achievement and to the American dream, to family cohesion. All these things are actually really, really important, and we ought to be praising and promoting. But tomorrow they could be coming for a different group, and you might be a part of that group. If we don't step up now, just because we're not Asian American, we may be on the losing end tomorrow. And I implore everyone who's listening to heed that advice. Just because they're not coming for you now, the authoritarians may be coming for you tomorrow. It's best to go ahead and get on the right side of righteousness, get on the right side of principle, and defend our fellow Americans who are being mistreated.
Thank you, Devin. Lance?
Well, first of all, I want to thank again the National Association for Scholars for organizing this terrific event. And it's been great to be on this wonderful panel with Devin and Wai Wah and with Wen Yun as our moderator. I would just say that, when you look at what Asian Americans are contributing to this battle right now, I think that one of the things, especially that is valuable, is the fact that they bring along a type of experience and history that many people in this country have not been exposed to. And in our book, The Great Parent Revolt, that Wen Yun and I co-authored, we interviewed a Chinese immigrant mom named Xi Van Fleet, who grew up in communist China, but not just that, but she actually lived through Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. And so she saw the impact of dividing people based upon, disfavored ideas, disfavored family, disfavored, classifications. And so what she saw back in China, she sees here going on in America, only we are not dividing people based upon economic class or whether you are a landowner or rich or poor. We're dividing people based upon race. But the principle of division in society is still the same, which is why, what goes on in the admission systems based upon race, and also critical race theory, which is going on in both in public schools, private schools, and in higher education. It's all division based upon race, which is all based upon racial Marxism. And so therefore, I think that, people like, first generation Chinese immigrants, especially because they've seen what's gone on in their homeland, can bring to this debate a aspect that most Americans are totally unaware of. Most Americans have no idea about what went on in the Cultural Revolution. And I think that that's why Asian Americans, based upon their history, and I know that in my case, my own grandfather was put in an internment camp during World War II by the government based upon his race. And so we understand, as Japanese Americans, the consequences of, dividing people and targeting people because of their race, and what can happen to that when you give government the authority to do that. And so, I think that, that's what makes Asian Americans particularly effective exponents of objective, race-neutral criteria for whatever good that there is to be had in this society. So with that, I close my remarks and say thank you again.
Thank you, Lance. Wai Wah.
I want to thank you, Wenyuan, my co-panelist, and NSS for hosting us. This is a important topic for us as we're at crossroads in this country. We laugh at it. I saw all your faces laughing when I said domestic terrorists, because you understand that's what we are charged with by Merrick Garland. When Merrick Garland called parents domestic terrorists for speaking up at school board meetings, that's a slur. That's a slur. And we have to be able to speak up because it is important. It is our turn to go and make the case to everybody to come out and reach out, because this is our country altogether. And as Devin was saying, you come from a background that is extremely multicultural in one person. And how do we judge you as an individual? By what you do. And this is what America is about, because we have people from every single race living together here. This is the American experiment, which has succeeded better than any other country in the history of the world, actually. And we see that people are working together. They are our colleagues of all sorts of different races. We have their neighbors, our friends, and increasingly our families. We all belong together here, and it is important not to divide us. The collective judgment that is being applied by race is wrong, and we must remain united. And we thank you for this forum to be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Wai Wah. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye now.